G'day, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining us for another edition of the Big Bad Brad Show MMA. My name is Brad Williams, and every single week we aim to provide you with a fan's eye view of the sport of mixed martial arts from way up the back in the cheap seats. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/BigBadBradMMA. You can find us on Twitter at BigBadBradMMA, and you can also find us on YouTube. Just search Big Bad Brad Show, and you'll be able to find us. No dramas at all. This afternoon has been an absolutely incredible time to be a UFC fan. I'm referencing, of course, UFC 199. Just wrapped up minutes ago as of the recording of the podcast. And it really was just the perfect example of what it means to be a fight fan. There's so much to talk about coming out of that event. The first thing I want to discuss this week is an announcement that I would say nobody saw coming. It came from absolutely nowhere, and that was the announcement of the return of the former UFC heavyweight champion of the world, Brock Lesnar, at UFC 200. My understanding, when there was rumblings a few months back about a return of Brock and fighting at Madison Square Garden, and he's still contracted to the WWE and will be for some time. The WWE has confirmed since the announcement of Brock's return that it will, well, as far as they're concerned, it will be a one-shot deal. So he is still contracted to the WWE. He'll fight at UFC 200 one time and then return to pro wrestling. This absolutely came out of nowhere. When the story, Ariel Helwani broke the story this morning, Australian time, and it was the first that there'd been any mention of Brock Lesnar coming back. And within a couple of hours, the UFC confirmed it on the UFC 199 broadcast. I am so excited about Brock Lesnar returning to the UFC. I know that Brock's a very polarizing figure when it comes to MMA. For every person that loved him, there were probably 10 that thought that he didn't belong there. The fact of the matter is, Brock Lesnar is one of the most accomplished grapplers ever to compete in mixed martial arts. He was an NCAA Division I heavyweight champion. That is legit. Forget the WWE and all that sort of stuff. At one point in time, he was the best amateur wrestler in America. You can't take away what he was able to accomplish in such a short amount of time. With a superstar the likes of Brock Lesnar, he had no choice but to do it the way he did as far as his first run in the UFC back in 2008. He had zero amateur experience, no striking experience, never had an opportunity to cut his teeth in the regional shows. He had one fight for K1, and his second ever mixed martial arts fight was in the UFC against Frank Mir, a former heavyweight champion of the world. That fight went for 90 seconds, and Brock Lesnar was winning 89 seconds of it before he got caught in a knee bar. In his fourth ever professional fight, he became the UFC heavyweight champion of the world. I don't understand how you can not respect a guy like Brock Lesnar. One of the things I was worried about with UFC 200 was when Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz fell through, I thought that you have immediately then lost your casual fans, because you're always going to have your hardcore fans. People that love mixed martial arts and love the UFC were always going to be on board for UFC 200 regardless of who was on the card. Your casual fans are what's going to put it over the top. As far as intangibles like a buy rate and how much money the UFC was going to make, the numbers on pay-per-view and all that sort of stuff. Your casual fans are all going to come back now. There's no doubt about it. People that have never seen the UFC before will know who Brock Lesnar is, and they're just as likely to tune in and see what Brock Lesnar looks like now as they would have been to tune in to see this Conor McGregor fella and what all the fuss was about. I think Brock Lesnar as an addition to UFC 200 is a huge, huge deal. As soon as they announced it today on UFC 199, I was straight online to see how much flights were, and I got no money. You don't want to know the things I would do to be able to go to UFC 200 and see Brock Lesnar fight live in person. The question turns now to who will Brock Lesnar be facing? The clear choice in my mind, and the only one that makes sense, is Mark Hunt. Everyone else in the UFC's top 10 is currently booked. Except for Junior Dos Santos, who I believe is recovering from shoulder surgery. You got Cain Velasquez taking on Travis Brown at UFC 200. Josh Barnett is scheduled to take on Andrei Arlovski in Germany. Alistair Overeem is taking on Stipe Miocic for the UFC Heavyweight Championship. And that's pretty much it as far as the pointy end of the heavyweight division. Oh, of course, and Fabricio Verdum taking on Big Ben Rothwell. So they're all locked into fights. The only person in the top 10 that's free and able to fight is Mark Hunt. We know that Mark Hunt has been told by Dana White to stay ready for UFC 200. There's rumblings that Mark Hunt may already be on his way to the States to get himself acclimatized to being in America and ready to compete at UFC 200. Ariel Helwani announced today on Twitter that Josh Barnett was actively campaigning for a fight with Brock Lesnar, which would mean they would find a replacement for him versus Andrei Arlovski. There's going to be fighters coming out of the woodwork for this fight with Brock Lesnar. One, he is seen by a lot of people to be a beatable fighter, due to his, his inability to avoid punishment. We saw it in the Shane Carwin fight. We saw it in the Cain Velasquez fight. He is known to take shots. But Brock Lesnar is not an easy out for anyone, depending on how much training he has been doing leading up to UFC 200. Another name that has been thrown around is Fedor Emelianenko. A couple of interesting things to come out of UFC 199. The first of which, Fedor is scheduled to fight Fabio Maldonado in 2 weeks on a European Fight Nights card, which is being broadcast on UFC Fight Pass. So for the first time ever, the UFC acknowledged Fedor, both in promoting his fight with Maldonado and also in their all-time fighter. There was records, I think it was most fights or most wins or something like that, combined UFC, Pride, Strikeforce, WEC, and Fedor was acknowledged on the broadcast. Whether that means anything, I don't know. But Fedor is another name that's been thrown up as an opponent for Brock Lesnar, which would also be a huge deal because they were supposed to fight a couple of years back. The UFC tried to put it together for a fight at Cowboy Stadium, which would have, they were hoping, attracted a crowd of over 100,000 people. That's another one that is a possibility. But I think logistically, the only person that makes sense is Mark Hunt. But it'll all be announced tomorrow, so there's not going to be much need for speculation. The word coming out of the States is that it will be announced on ESPN Sports Center tomorrow, so we will find out who Brock Lesnar will be taking on at UFC 200. I cannot wait. I'm out of breath just talking about it. I'm so excited. It's just a great thing for the sport, it's a great thing for UFC 200, and it's a great thing for the fans. So Brock Lesnar is officially back in the UFC. For how long, we don't know. We will find out. The other big stories to come out of UFC 199, and there were so many. 45-year-old Dan Henderson winding back the clock against Hector Lombard, scoring a second-round knockout. You got to remember with Hector Lombard is a former Bellator middleweight champion. He was one of the most feared middleweights on the planet. He went down to welterweight, went on a tear, and was actually scheduled for a number one contenders fight with Rory McDonald before he was flagged for an anti-doping violation and suspended. He came back, was defeated in Brisbane by Neil Magny, and moved back up to middleweight for this fight with Dan Henderson. So Hector Lombard is legit. He is a legitimate challenge at both welterweight and middleweight. This is the last fight on Dan Henderson's contract with the UFC. And there were people that looked at this fight and thought, man, that's just not fair to chuck Dan Henderson in there with Hector Lombard. Hendo came out in the first round and cracked Hector Lombard. And then also got dropped himself and almost finished. Fought back through that adversity, came out in the second round, lands a head kick and knocks Hector Lombard out with a back elbow. It was incredible. He did say after the fight that may be the last time we see Dan Henderson in the octagon. If it is, Dan Henderson, congratulations on a stellar career. Former Strikeforce champion, former two-time Pride champion, UFC tournament winner, and he will go down as one of the greatest of all time if he does decide to hang him up. And it was a fantastic moment to see Dan Henderson score such a huge victory in what could potentially be his last fight ever. Also at UFC 199, we saw Max Holloway extend his winning streak in the UFC featherweight division to 9 fights in a row. He is officially the only fighter in history ever to go on a 9-fight winning streak in the UFC and still not receive a title shot. I know there's a bit of clutter at the top of the featherweight division with Conor McGregor fighting Nate Diaz, which was also made official today. God, how much news can you jam into one day? So if Max is to fight for the strap, he could have to wait a little bit longer. Frankie Edgar and Jose Aldo competing for the interim title at UFC 200, but he just looked unreal. And the last 10 seconds of that fight were insane. He was lighting up Ricardo Lamas, just picking him to pieces with his boxing and really putting on such a great striking display. And at the end of the last round, he looked at Ricardo Lamas, pointed to the ground and said, do you want to just have a go? And Lamas said, yeah, why not? And they planted their feet and just slugged it out until the end of the third round. It was amazing. Another fantastic performance for Max Holloway and someone absolutely deserving of a title fight whenever that opportunity might come. In the co-main event today, we saw the trilogy fight between Uriah Faber and UFC bantamweight champion Dominic Cruz. A fight 10 years in the making, such a personal feud between these two guys who really, truly do not like each other. They went into this fight with 1 win apiece, and this was the deciding fight in the trilogy, and Dominic Cruz just picked Uriah Faber to pieces. Put on an absolute clinic. The first fight was very close. It was very grappling heavy. In the second round, Dominic Cruz dropped Uriah Faber, and Faber just never seemed to recover. Dominic Cruz is a master of movement and truly now must be considered the best bantamweight in UFC history, if not mixed martial arts history, full stop. What this means for Faber, he did acknowledge after the fight that it may well be the last time we see him in the octagon as well. If that is the case, much the same as Dan Henderson, Uriah Faber has been such an important fighter in the history of the mixed martial arts landscape. He really was the first of the lighter weight fighters to make people care about fighters under 155 pounds. Without Uriah Faber, we may not have ever seen bantamweights and flyweights and featherweights in the UFC. He really was that important. So if it is the last time we see Uriah Faber, massive congratulations. One of the biggest knocks, well, not a knock on Faber, I shouldn't say that, but one of the things that people mentioned as something that could potentially tarnish his legacy is that he was never a UFC champion. But you got to remember, Uriah Faber was a world champion. For a long time, the WEC, for the lighter weight divisions, was considered the top of the pile. It was a Zuffa promotion, who also owned the UFC. And Uriah Faber was their featherweight champion for a long, long time. He lost that belt to Mike Brown, who then lost the belt to Jose Aldo, and he became the UFC featherweight champion when the UFC absorbed the WEC. So with its lineage, that is the title that Uriah Faber held. So while he was never a UFC champion, and at this stage it looks like he most likely won't be, he was a world champion for a long time and will still go down as one of the greatest fighters ever, UFC title or not. And a massive congratulations to Dominic Cruz on another fantastic performance in a career that's filled with them. What's next for Dominic Cruz? There is talk of a super fight with Mighty Mouse, but Mighty Mouse's plate is pretty full at the moment, with a fight coming up with Wilson Hayes at UFC 201, and also potentially, if he gets through Wilson Hayes, the winner of the Ultimate Fighter Season 24. So if he is going to fight Cruz, it's probably not going to be for a long time. But last week, Cody Garbrandt stormed forward as a contender in the UFC's bantamweight division. We have TJ Dillashaw and Rafael Assunção going head-to-head at UFC 200. That could potentially crown the number one contender. Brian Caraway with a fantastic performance over Aljamain Sterling last week. So it's not like there's a shortage of contenders at the pointy end of the bantamweight division for Dominic Cruz. So stay tuned and we'll keep you posted with anything that might break in that regard as well. We move now to the main event of the evening. And what a story. My goodness. So, for people that don't know, Chris Weidman was scheduled to challenge Luke Rockhold for the UFC Middleweight Championship. 2 weeks ago, Chris Weidman withdrew from the fight with an injury, and Michael Bisping stepped up on short notice to challenge Luke Rockhold for the Middleweight Championship of the world. For people that may not be aware, Michael Bisping, almost to the day, won the Ultimate Fighter and scored himself a UFC contract 10 years ago. For the next 10 years, he worked his way up to being a top contender in the middleweight division. And he was one of those fighters that just got just within reaching distance of the brass ring, but seemed like he just wasn't going to get there. He was always, a lot of people considered Michael Bisping to be a good fighter who just wasn't quite great. But he chipped away and always believed in himself that he could become a champion of the world. When this fight was announced, I was one of those people that thought it's amazing that Michael Bisping's finally going to get his chance at a UFC championship of the world. But I just can't see him beating Luke Rockhold. The two had already fought back in Sydney in 2014. Luke Rockhold scored a submission victory over Michael Bisping after rocking him with a head kick. And Rockhold, he did it so easily in the first fight that it was strange to see this second fight going any differently. But someone forgot to tell Michael Bisping about the script, because he came into this fight today at UFC 199. Rockhold looked relaxed. He himself suggested that he was maybe a little bit too confident in coming into the fight, and Michael Bisping knocked him out in the first round to become the UFC middleweight champion of the world. And to me, that is exactly what this sport is all about. It's why we watch it. It's for moments like that. I mean, it was just incredible. I watched the fight with my brother and a few mates at my place today, and I mean, we all had money on Luke Rockhold. And when Michael Bisping knocked him out, we jumped up off our lounges and high-fived and couldn't believe what we'd just seen. And that's the beauty of being a fight fan. And there isn't a fighter in the UFC that deserves to be a world champion as much as Michael Bisping. So a massive congratulations. We've probably got a ready-made main event world title fight rematch between he and Luke Rockhold. It'll be a trilogy fight. Weidman's also in the mix once he's recovered from his injury. He's just completely flipped the middleweight division on its head. And Michael Bisping should be so proud of his accomplishments, and he is now officially a UFC world champion. It was interesting this week. There was a journalist in Australia that gained worldwide attention for an article that she wrote. And I'm not going to mention this journalist's name because I don't want to give her any more press than she's already had. But basically her article said, go away UFC, Australia doesn't want you here anymore. In a nutshell. And that really, to me, it hurts my heart. It's so frustrating as someone that's a fight fan. And for me, mixed martial arts has been such a big part of my life for the last 17 years. It's everything that sport is supposed to be. It's something that you, as a fan, can lose yourself in and become so invested in, and it's everything that's good about the world. I'm not naive to the fact that mixed martial arts is not for everyone. It is a violent sport. There's no denying that. But it's something that can make four blokes in their 30s jump up off the lounges and hug each other, can that really be such a bad thing? It's as pure as anything else you're ever likely to experience in your life. And for this journalist to say that Australia doesn't want the UFC back, absolutely not. She doesn't speak for me. She doesn't speak for the 56,000 people that were in Etihad Stadium when Holly Holm fought Ronda Rousey and beat her for the Bantamweight Championship. I'll never forget being there that day. I'll never forget that feeling. I'll never forget the feeling of seeing Mark Hunt and Bigfoot Silva go to war in Brisbane. I'll never forget the feeling of seeing Bigfoot Silva come from behind and knock out Alistair Overeem in Vegas. I'll never forget being in Las Vegas to see Anderson Silva fight Nick Diaz and standing there with a tear in my eye because I couldn't believe that I was actually there watching the greatest of all time in person. Can something that makes you feel like that really be a bad thing? I don't think so. And I know that a lot of people around the world don't think so either. And just a hot tip for these journos too, that are so outraged by the UFC and think that it's going to be the downfall of society as we know it. If you're so staunchly opposed to it, can you at least educate yourselves a little bit? Because for the millionth time, a journalist compared the UFC to mixed martial arts. So let's just clear this up now, okay? The UFC is not a sport. The UFC is a sports organisation. They are a promotion. Mixed martial arts is the sport. To say that the UFC is similar to MMA is like saying that the NRL is similar to rugby league. Can you see how stupid that is? If you hate it so much and you want to dedicate so much of your time to trying to bring it down, at least educate yourselves a little bit. That's all I ask. The fact of the matter is, it's 2016, folks. If you don't want to watch mixed martial arts, you don't have to. But telling other people that they can't, that's not going to happen. So put your remote down, change the channel if you want to. You have every right to do that. What you don't have the right to do is tell people that they can't watch it themselves. So that's my piece as far as that goes. In other news, it was announced today, and it was probably the worst kept secret in mixed martial arts, but it was made official. Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz 2, UFC 202, August 21st in Las Vegas, Australian time. It was the rematch that had to happen after all of the kerfuffle that happened around UFC 200 and Conor being pulled from the card, and then Nate saying he wasn't fighting anyone but Conor, and then it seemed like the contract negotiations fell through, and the UFC threw us a curveball this week by saying that Nate wouldn't sign on the dotted line, and they were looking for new opponents for Conor. We might have all been taken for a ride because the fight is locked in, it's official, it's happening. UFC 202, McGregor versus Diaz 2, August 21st, Australian time. It's going to be massive, and I cannot wait. And today has just been one of those days where I'm so proud to be a fight fan. It really is everything that makes us as fight fans the luckiest sport fans in the world. Bisping, the culmination of a 10-year journey, becomes a world champion. Dominic Cruz cements his place as the bantamweight best of all time. Dan Henderson, at 45 years old, knocks out Hector Lombard in the second round. Brock Lesnar announced as making his return at UFC 200. And finally, Nate Diaz versus Conor McGregor 2 is official. I am absolutely exhausted. So with that, it brings us to the end of another edition of the Big Bad Brad Show MMA. I cannot thank you enough for checking out the podcast. I really do appreciate it. As I said at the top of the show, you can find us at facebook.com/BigBadBradMMA. You can find me on Twitter at BigBadBradMMA, and you can find us on YouTube. Just search Big Bad Brad Show MMA, and you'll be able to find us. No dramas at all. I hope you enjoyed the fights. Thank you so much for checking out the podcast, and I will catch you next time.